In a small town in the southern part of the country, where racial tensions often bubbled under the surface, an ordinary man found himself caught in an extraordinary and deeply unfair situation. This man, a hard-working mechanic with calloused hands and a heart full of dreams for his family, was no stranger to challenges. But nothing could have prepared him for what was about to unfold inside a courtroom that day. It all started when he got a call from an elderly neighbor who lived just a few blocks away. She sounded worried, explaining that her backyard fence had collapsed after a storm. The broken fence left her property exposed, and she feared it might attract troublemakers or stray animals. Being the kind of person who always lent a hand, he didn't think twice before grabbing his toolbox and heading over. He spent hours fixing the fence, refusing any payment because, as he told her, neighbors help each other out. But things took a turn when the homeowner's son returned unexpectedly. Without listening to explanations, the young man accused him of trespassing and called the police. Despite the elderly woman vouching for him, the authorities arrived and arrested him on the spot. It was shocking, humiliating, and completely unjust. Yet the nightmare didn't end there. It only grew worse once he stepped into the courtroom. The judge presiding over the case was known throughout the town for his harsh rulings and even harsher attitude. His name carried weight, but not in a good way. People whispered about how he seemed to treat people differently based on the color of their skin. For years, folks in the community had grumbled about his behavior, but nobody dared to speak up, publicly. And now, here he was, sitting high above the courtroom, glaring down at this man who stood nervously before him. As the proceedings began, the atmosphere in the room felt heavy. The man's lawyer tried his best to present the truth. He explained that his client wasn't guilty of anything except being helpful. There were witnesses, like the elderly neighbor, who confirmed the story. Photos of the damaged fence and tools used for repair were shown as evidence. Everything pointed to the fact that this was a simple misunderstanding, not a crime. Yet, none of it mattered to the judge. Instead of considering the facts, he mocked the defense. With a smirk, he made snide comments about the man's appearance, suggesting that his clothes somehow proved he was guilty. The words stung, not just because they came from someone in power, but because they were steeped in prejudice. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the man clenched his fists, trying desperately to stay calm despite the humiliation washing over him. His wife sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. Their children weren't present. They were too young to witness such cruelty. But she couldn't stop thinking about how scared they'd be if they saw their father treated this way. She wanted to scream, to demand fairness, but she knew better than to interrupt. So she bit her lip and prayed silently for justice to prevail. Meanwhile, the judge continued his tirade, dismissing every piece of evidence presented by the defense. He acted as though the truth didn't matter, as though the law was something he could bend to fit his own biases. When the man mustered the courage to ask why he was being treated so unfairly, the judge slammed his gavel and accused him of showing disrespect to the court. Just like that, the sentence came down. 6 months in jail for trespassing and contempt of court. The room erupted in gasps. Friends and supporters shook their heads in disbelief. How could this happen? How could someone so clearly innocent be punished so severely? As bailiffs led the man away, his wife burst into sobs, shouting at the judge to reconsider. But her cries fell on deaf ears. Within moments, she was escorted out of the courtroom, leaving behind a trail of anger and despair. Outside, news of the verdict spread quickly through the tight-knit community. Neighbors gathered, some expressing outrage, while others shared stories of similar injustices they'd witnessed or experienced themselves. Among the crowd stood a seasoned detective, who had seen more than his fair share of questionable cases. Something about this particular story tugged at his conscience. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more to fight for. Little did anyone know, this moment would mark the beginning of a journey toward justice. One that would challenge the very foundations of power in the town. For the man locked away in a cell, hope seemed distant. But sometimes, even in the darkest places, light finds a way to break through. Unbeknownst to him, forces were already at work, determined to expose the truth and hold those in power accountable. What happened next would change not only his life, but the lives of countless others who had long suffered in silence. The verdict hit the community like a thunderclap. People were angry, not just because of what had happened in the courtroom, but because it felt so painfully familiar. Stories like this weren't new to the town. For years, residents had whispered about the judge's bias, his harsh sentences for people who looked like the mechanic, and his leniency toward those with money or influence. But this time, something was different. This time, the injustice wasn't happening behind closed doors. It was out in the open, raw and undeniable. As word spread, more and more people began talking about it. Friends gathered at local coffee shops, families discussed it over dinner, and social media lit up with posts calling for answers. The mechanic's wife became a central figure in these conversations. She was heartbroken, yes, but she was also determined. Every day she visited her husband in jail, bringing updates from the outside world and promising him that they wouldn't give up without a fight. Her strength inspired others to join the cause, turning whispers into action. One person who couldn't stop thinking about the case was a veteran detective from the local police department. He'd been on the force for over 2 decades, long enough to see how the system worked, and sometimes, how it failed. To him, this wasn't just another arrest gone wrong. It was a glaring example of everything he hated about corruption and prejudice. He knew the mechanic personally. Everyone in the neighborhood did. The man was known for fixing cars at a fair price, helping neighbors in need, and coaching kids' soccer teams on weekends. The idea that someone like him could be locked away, based on flimsy accusations, was infuriating. Determined to dig deeper, the detective started by visiting the elderly neighbor who had called the mechanic for help in the first place. She welcomed him into her modest home, offering him a cup of tea as she recounted the events leading up to the arrest. Her voice trembled with emotion as she described how grateful she had been for his kindness, and how horrified she was when the situation spiraled out of control. "He didn't do anything wrong," she insisted, clutching a tissue in her hand. "I told the police that, but they didn't care." The detective listened intently, jotting down notes. When he asked if she had any proof of the mechanic's innocence, she nodded eagerly and pulled out her phone. Scrolling through her messages, she showed him texts exchanged between her and the mechanic before the incident. They talked about the broken fence, the tools needed for repairs, and even joked about how stubborn the old wood was being. These messages painted a clear picture. The mechanic wasn't trespassing. He was doing exactly what he said he was doing. But the detective didn't stop there. Knowing that evidence alone might not be enough to sway the powers that be, he decided to look for more. He drove around the neighborhood, checking for security cameras that might have captured footage of the mechanic working on the fence. After knocking on doors and making calls, he finally struck gold. A camera mounted on a nearby convenience store had recorded part of the scene. Though the angle wasn't perfect, it clearly showed the mechanic kneeling beside the fence, hammering nails and adjusting planks. There was no sign of suspicious behavior, just a man quietly going about his work. With this new evidence in hand, the detective felt a spark of hope. But he also knew that proving the mechanic's innocence was only half the battle. If they wanted real change, they needed to address the bigger issue, the judge's blatant abuse of power. Rumors about the judge's misconduct weren't hard to find. Over the years, people had muttered about favoritism, bribes, and threats, used to strong-arm defendants into unfair deals. However, none of these claims had ever been proven, until now. The detective began digging into the judge's past cases, looking for patterns. What he found shocked even him. In several instances, the judge had handed down unusually harsh sentences to individuals from marginalized communities while letting wealthier defendants off with slaps on the wrist. Some of these cases involved property disputes, where homeowners claimed they were forced to sell their land at rock-bottom prices after facing baseless legal charges. One name kept popping up repeatedly: a wealthy real estate developer with ties to shady business practices. Connecting the dots, the detective realized there might be more to the story than met the eye. Could the judge and the developer be working together? Was this arrest part of a larger scheme to intimidate residents into giving up their properties? The thought sent chills down his spine, but it also fueled his determination to uncover the truth. He reached out to a trusted colleague in the district attorney's office, a woman known for her integrity and commitment to justice. At first, she was hesitant to get involved. Cases involving judges were tricky, fraught with political risks and potential backlash. But when the detective laid out the evidence, the text messages, the security footage, the suspicious patterns in the EOR, Judge AMNVT, the detective sat across from the district attorney, his hands resting on a folder stuffed with papers, photos, and notes. He could see the hesitation in her eyes, but he also knew she was the kind of person who cared deeply about fairness. She wasn't someone who would shy away from doing what was right. She just needed to be sure they had enough to stand on before taking such a bold step. "Look," he said, sliding the folder toward her. "I know this is risky, and I know judges don't like being questioned. But if we don't act now, nothing will change. This isn't just about one man. It's about all the others who've been treated this way and haven't had anyone to speak up for them." She opened the folder slowly, her brow furrowing as she flipped through the contents. The text messages between the elderly neighbor and the mechanic showed no hint of wrongdoing, just friendly exchanges about fixing a fence. The security footage, grainy but clear enough, captured him working diligently, sweat glistening on his forehead as he hammered nails into place. Then there were the patterns. Case after case where the judge handed down outrageously harsh sentences to people of color, while letting wealthy defendants walk free with little more than a slap on the wrist. But it was the final piece of evidence that made her sit back in her chair, her expression hardening. The detective had uncovered a series of emails that linked the judge to a powerful real estate developer notorious for pushing people off their land. These weren't vague accusations. They were concrete proof of a corrupt relationship. One email stood out in particular. It read, "Make an example of him. Let everyone else know not to get in our way." The him referred to the mechanic, whose arrest and sentencing seemed designed to send a chilling message to anyone resisting the developer's plans. The district attorney exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples. She looked at the detective, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Do you realize what this means? If we go after him, it's not just going to be about this case. We're talking about exposing decades of corruption. People are going to fight back hard." "I know," the detective replied, leaning forward. "But isn't that why we do this job? To protect people who can't protect themselves? To make sure justice actually means something?" She nodded slowly, her resolve strengthening. "All right, let's do this. But we need to be smart about it. No mistakes, no loose ends. If we're going to take him down, we have to catch him red-handed." A plan takes shape. With the district attorney on board, the two began crafting a plan to expose the judge's misconduct. They knew it wouldn't be easy. Judges held immense power, and accusing one of corruption without ironclad evidence would only lead to disaster. Their strategy hinged on catching the judge in the act, forcing him to reveal his true colors in front of witnesses who couldn't be ignored. The mechanic's upcoming appeal hearing provided the perfect opportunity. By law, the judge was required to review the new evidence presented by the defense. If he dismissed it outright or acted in a manner that confirmed his bias, they could use it against him. But they needed someone inside the courtroom to document every move he made, someone who could hold authority figures accountable when the moment came. That's where the detective stepped in. He volunteered to attend the hearing undercover, posing as a concerned citizen observing the trial. His role would be simple yet crucial: watch, listen, and intervene only if absolutely necessary. The district attorney agreed, emphasizing that timing was everything. If the detective revealed his identity too soon, the judge might clam up or call a recess. But if he waited for the right moment, when the judge's prejudice was undeniable, they could strike decisively. Preparation and tension in the days leading up to the hearing, the mechanic's family and friends rallied together, determined to show their support. His wife organized a group to attend the hearing, filling the courtroom with faces from the community. Some brought signs, though they kept them hidden until afterward to avoid causing a scene. Others simply came to bear witness, knowing that their presence alone sent a powerful message. Meanwhile, the mechanic himself remained locked away, unaware of the storm brewing outside. His wife visited him daily, bringing updates and reassurances. "Something big is happening," she told him during one visit. "People are standing up for you, just hang in there." Though he appreciated her optimism, doubt lingered in his mind. After everything he'd been through, the arrest, the mockery, the unfair sentence, he found it hard to believe that things could turn around so quickly. Still, he clung to hope, drawing strength from her unwavering determination. On the morning of the hearing, the air buzzed with anticipation. Supporters filled the courtroom, their murmurs creating a low hum that echoed off the walls. Reporters lingered near the entrance, sensing that this wasn't going to be an ordinary day in court. Even the bailiffs seemed uneasy, exchanging glances as they ushered people to their seats. The detective arrived last, slipping into the back row unnoticed. He wore plain clothes, a jacket, jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Beneath his calm exterior, however, his heart raced. He knew the weight of what was at stake. If this went wrong, it wouldn't just cost him his career. It could silence any chance of holding the judge accountable for years to come. Finally, the doors swung open, and the judge entered. His robe billowed behind him as he strode to the bench, his expression unreadable. As he took his seat and called the courtroom to order, the tension became almost unbearable. Everyone braced themselves, unsure of what was about to unfold, but certain that this day would leave a mark on the town forever. For the mechanic sitting nervously beside his lawyer, it felt like the longest moment of his life. For the detective, watching silently from the shadows, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for the judge, blissfully unaware of the trap closing in around him, it was just another day in court. Or so he thought. The courtroom was packed to the brim, with every seat occupied and some people standing along the walls. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Supporters of the mechanic filled the room. Family, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard about the case and wanted to witness what might happen next. Reporters scribbled notes in the corner, their pens moving furiously as they tried to capture the mood of the room. Outside, a small crowd gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and no more bias." It wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about sending a message that unfairness wouldn't be tolerated. As the judge took his seat, he glanced around the crowded room, his expression unreadable. To him, this probably seemed like any other hearing, a routine appeal where he could flex his authority and remind everyone who was in charge. He didn't notice the detective sitting quietly in the back, blending into the crowd. He didn't see the nervous energy rippling through the room or the way people leaned forward slightly, ready to catch every word. All he saw was another defendant. Before him, someone he believed he could control. The mechanic's lawyer stood up, clearing his throat. He began by presenting the new evidence. The text messages between the elderly neighbor and the mechanic, the security footage showing him working on the fence, and affidavits from witnesses confirming his innocence. Each piece was laid out carefully, methodically, leaving no room for doubt. The lawyer spoke clearly, his voice steady but firm, making sure the judge understood that this wasn't a flimsy defense. It was undeniable proof of wrongdoing. But the judge barely listened. Instead, he interrupted constantly, cutting off the lawyer mid-sentence and dismissing each piece of evidence with a wave of his hand. "This is irrelevant," he snapped at one point. "A waste of my time." His tone dripped with disdain, and his body language screamed arrogance. He refused to look at the screen displaying the security footage, claiming it was blurry and therefore unreliable. When the lawyer mentioned the text messages, the judge rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath about how anyone could fake such things. It was during these moments that the tension in the room reached its peak. People shifted uncomfortably, in their seats exchanging glances. Some clenched their fists while others whispered urgent prayers. The mechanic's wife sat stiffly in the front row, her hands gripping the edge of her seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes never left the judge, watching his every move, studying his dismissive gestures and condescending remarks. She knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't just ignoring the evidence, he was mocking it, mocking them, mocking the very idea of fairness. Then came the moment that made everyone freeze. The judge leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, and fixed his gaze directly on the mechanic. "You think you can waltz into court and play games?" he sneered. "You're wasting taxpayer money with your lies. Maybe 6 months isn't enough. Maybe you need more time to learn respect." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Even the bailiffs exchanged uneasy looks. This wasn't justice, this was cruelty disguised as law. The mechanic's shoulders slumped, but he kept his head high, refusing to let the judge break him completely. His wife, however, couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's not fair," she shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. "How can you call yourself a judge when you won't even listen to the truth?" Before anyone could react, 2 bailiffs rushed over and escorted her out of the courtroom. As she went, she locked eyes with her husband, mouthing the words, "We're fighting for you." Then she was gone, leaving behind an eerie silence. The detective steps forward, in the back of the room. The detective watched everything unfold. Every insult, every dismissal, every ounce of prejudice confirmed what he already suspected. This man wasn't interested in justice. He was using his position to bully and intimidate, to maintain power over those he deemed beneath him. The detective felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Timing was everything. He couldn't act too soon, not until the judge painted himself into a corner. Finally, the lawyer finished presenting his case. He looked at the judge, his face etched with frustration, but also hope. "Your Honor," he said, "we've provided overwhelming evidence of my client's innocence. I urge you to reconsider your decision and overturn the conviction." The judge smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Overwhelming evidence?" he repeated mockingly. "All I see are excuses. Guilty is guilty, and I stand by my ruling." That was the opening the detective had been waiting for. Slowly, deliberately, he rose from his seat. At first, no one noticed him, but as he stepped into the aisle, heads turned. The room fell silent as he walked toward the front, his presence commanding attention. He stopped a few feet away from the bench, his eyes locked on the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "I'm Detective Carter with the City Police Department. Before you proceed further, I'd like to present additional evidence that may clarify the situation." The judge frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "Who are you?" he demanded. "This is my courtroom. Sit down or leave." Instead of obeying, the detective reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for everyone to see. The golden shield gleamed under the fluorescent lights, drawing gasps from the crowd. The judge's face paled, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time. "I'm here to address allegations of misconduct," the detective continued, his tone unwavering. "Specifically, your involvement in illegal activities related to property disputes and coercion. We have emails linking you to a real estate developer accused of exploiting residents through fraudulent legal actions. These emails suggest that cases like this one," he gestured toward the mechanic, "were deliberately manipulated to serve personal interests." The judge stammered, trying to deny the accusations. "This is absurd. You have no right." But the detective cut him off, pulling out printed copies of the incriminating emails. One by one, he read excerpts aloud, each word landing like a hammer blow. The emails detailed threats, bribes, and plans to intimidate homeowners into selling their properties. They named specific individuals, including the mechanic, as examples of making a statement. By the time the detective finished, the judge's face was ashen, his hands shaking visibly. People in the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Some cheered softly, tears streaming down their faces. Others simply stared in disbelief, unable to process what they were witnessing. For years, this man had wielded unchecked power, ruining lives without consequence. Now finally the truth was coming to light. The fallout. The bailiffs moved quickly to detain the judge, cuffing his wrists as he protested weakly. As he was led away, the mechanic sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the turn of events. For months, he had carried the weight of injustice on his shoulders, believing there was no way out. Now, in a matter of minutes, the tables had turned. Justice wasn't just possible. It was happening right in front of him. Outside the courtroom, news of the arrest spread like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to get statements from witnesses, while supporters celebrated in the hallway, hugging and crying with relief. The mechanic's wife returned, throwing her arms around him as soon as she saw him. "We did it," she whispered. "We really did it." For the detective, the victory was bittersweet. He knew this was only the beginning of a much larger fight against corruption and inequality. But seeing the mechanic reunited with his family gave him hope. Hope that even in the darkest places, light could still shine through, and that together, people could stand up and demand change. The arrest of the judge sent shockwaves through the town. People who had lived in fear of his unchecked power for years were suddenly electrified by the possibility of change. The courtroom drama that unfolded earlier felt like something out of a movie, but it was real, and its impact rippled far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For the mechanic and his family, the moment was surreal. One day, he was sitting in a jail cell, convinced that the system would never work in his favor. The next, he was free, surrounded by loved ones and strangers alike, all celebrating a victory that felt almost too good to be true. As news of the scandal spread, reporters descended on the small town, eager to uncover every detail. Local TV stations aired special segments, newspapers published front-page stories, and social media buzzed with hashtags like Clear Justice for All and Twitter No More Corruption. The mechanic's case became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even when the odds seemed impossible, standing up for what's right could lead to real change. His wife found herself at the center of it all, giving interviews and sharing their story with anyone who would listen. She spoke passionately about how her husband's arrest wasn't just an isolated incident, it was part of a pattern of abuse that had gone on for far too long. But not everyone was thrilled about the turn of events. Some residents grumbled that the judge's arrest was overblown or politically motivated. A few even defended him, claiming that his tough stance kept order in the community. These voices were loud, but they were drowned out by the overwhelming support for accountability. Even those who had once feared speaking out now felt emboldened to share their own experiences of injustice. Stories poured in about wrongful arrests, unfair fines, and cases where people had been coerced into signing away their rights. Each tale added fuel to the growing movement for reform, a community united in. The days following the judge's arrest, the mechanic's family became a beacon of inspiration. Strangers stopped them in grocery stores to offer hugs and words of encouragement. Neighbors brought meals to their home, insisting they take time to rest and recover. Their children, who had been confused and scared during their father's absence, began smiling again, playing outside without worry. The sense of relief was palpable, not just for them, but for the entire community. The mechanic himself struggled to process everything. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Before this ordeal, he'd simply wanted to live a quiet life, fixing cars, helping neighbors, and providing for his family. Now, he was being hailed as a hero, someone who had exposed corruption and inspired others to fight back. At first, he felt uncomfortable with the attention. But as more people shared their gratitude, he realized that his experience had given them a voice, a chance to say, "This isn't okay." One evening, a group of friends and supporters organized a small gathering at the local park to celebrate the mechanic's release. It was meant to be low-key, but word spread quickly and soon hundreds of people showed up. There were speeches, songs, and heartfelt cheers. Someone handed the mechanic a microphone, urging him to say a few words. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, he stepped forward, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I didn't do anything special," he began, looking out at the sea of faces. "I was just trying to help someone fix a fence. But what happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone." No one should have to face lies and cruelty in a place where truth is supposed to matter most. We can't let fear stop us from standing up for each other. Together we're stronger than any bully, even if that bully wears a robe. His words earned thunderous applause, and many wiped away tears. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. Honest, humble, and full of conviction. In that moment, the crowd wasn't just cheering for him. They were cheering for themselves, for their shared determination to create a better future. The detective's reflection. Meanwhile, the detective found himself reflecting on the whirlwind of events. He hadn't expected the case to blow up the way it did. When he first started investigating, his goal was simple: prove the mechanic's innocence and expose the judge's bias. What he hadn't anticipated was the ripple effect. The way one man's story could ignite a fire in so many hearts. Everywhere he went, people thanked him, calling him a hero. But he shrugged off the praise, saying only, "I'm just doing my job." Still, deep down, he couldn't deny the pride he felt. After decades on the force, he'd seen plenty of cases that left him disillusioned. Times when justice felt like nothing more than a pipe dream. This time was different. This time he'd witnessed firsthand the power of courage and teamwork. Without the mechanic's resilience, his wife's determination, the elderly neighbor's honesty, and the district attorney's bravery, none of it would have been possible. It reminded him why he became a detective in the first place: to give a voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Yet he also knew the fight wasn't over. Arresting one corrupt judge wouldn't magically fix a broken system. There were still questions to answer, reforms to push for, and policies to change. Change didn't happen overnight, especially in places where tradition often outweighed progress. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that maybe, just maybe, this moment would mark the beginning of something bigger. Facing the truth back at the police station, the district attorney worked tirelessly to build a solid case against the judge. With the emails, witness testimonies, and patterns of misconduct laid out clearly, they were confident they could secure a conviction. However, prosecuting a judge wasn't easy. Legal teams clashed, motions were filed, and debates raged over jurisdiction and evidence admissibility. Every step forward seemed to come with 2 steps back. Despite the challenges, the district attorney refused to back down. She held meetings with community leaders, activists, and legal experts, seeking advice on how to ensure transparency throughout the process. Public trust was fragile, and she knew that any misstep could undermine the entire effort. To keep the public informed, she held regular press conferences, updating everyone on the progress of the investigation. Her message was consistent: we will not tolerate corruption. Justice must apply to everyone equally. Her dedication resonated with the townspeople, who continued to rally behind the cause. Fundraisers were organized to support the mechanic's legal fees, and petitions circulated demanding systemic reforms in the judicial system. Schools incorporated discussions about fairness and integrity into their lessons, using the unfolding events as real-world examples. The mechanic's story had sparked a conversation that went beyond one courtroom. It was about building a fairer, kinder society. Looking ahead, as weeks turned into months, life slowly returned to normal for the mechanic and his family. He went back to work, fixing cars and coaching soccer teams, though he remained active in advocating for justice. His wife joined a local advocacy group, working alongside others to push for policy changes that would prevent similar abuses of power in the future. Together, they became pillars of strength in their community, proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they stood together. For the detective, the case served as a turning point in his career. He began mentoring younger officers, teaching them the importance of integrity and perseverance. "It's not always easy to do the right thing," he told them. "But if you stay true to your values, you'll sleep soundly at night." And as for the town itself, it wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. Old prejudices lingered and new challenges arose. But something fundamental had shifted. People were talking openly about issues they'd once avoided. They were holding their leaders accountable and demanding better. That, more than anything, gave the mechanic and everyone else reason to believe that brighter days lay ahead. The trial against the disgraced judge became a landmark event in the town's history. It wasn't just another court case. It was a reckoning, a moment when the community demanded accountability from those who held power. The courtroom was packed every day, with people lining up hours before proceedings began just to secure a seat. Reporters filled the press gallery, their cameras clicking endlessly as lawyers argued, witnesses testified, and evidence piled up. For many, it felt like watching justice unfold in real time. The emails that had first exposed the judge's corruption were front and center. Each one painted a damning picture of greed and manipulation, showing how he conspired with the real estate developer to intimidate residents into selling their properties. Witnesses came forward, some reluctantly, others boldly, to describe how they had been pressured or threatened. One elderly woman recounted how she lost her family home after being slapped with baseless legal charges. Another man spoke about how he was jailed for months over a minor infraction, only to discover later that his property had been sold while he was locked away. Their stories weren't unique. They were echoes of what so many had endured silently, for years. As the days went on, the prosecution methodically dismantled the judge's defenses. His attempts to deny involvement fell flat under cross-examination, where even his own words betrayed him. The detective took the stand at one point, calmly recounting how he had uncovered the evidence and pieced together the puzzle. His testimony carried weight, not because of dramatic flair, but because of its simplicity and honesty. He didn't need theatrics. The truth spoke loudly enough. When the verdict finally came, it was unanimous. Guilty on multiple counts of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the foreman read out the decision. Some cheered softly while others wept openly, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. Outside, the crowd erupted in applause, chanting phrases like, "Justice served," and "No more fear." It wasn't just a victory for the mechanic. It was a win for everyone who had ever felt powerless against the system. A new chapter. For the mechanic, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could be after such a whirlwind experience. He went back to work, fixing cars and helping neighbors, but things weren't exactly the same. Strangers approached him in the street to shake his hand or thank him for standing strong. Parents told their kids about how one man's courage had sparked change in the community. At first, the attention made him uncomfortable. After all, he hadn't set out to be a hero. He'd simply tried to do the right thing. But over time, he came to see the bigger picture. His story had inspired others to speak up, to believe that fairness wasn't just a dream, but something worth fighting for. His wife also found herself transformed by the ordeal. Before, she'd been content to live quietly, focusing on raising their children and supporting her husband. Now, she was a vocal advocate for reform, attending meetings, organizing rallies, and speaking at events. She joined forces with other activists to push for changes in the judicial system, including stricter oversight of judges and better protections for defendants. Her passion was contagious, drawing in volunteers young and old who wanted to make a difference. Their children, too, seemed different. They were proud of their parents, not just for surviving the storm, but for leading the charge toward a brighter future. In school, they stood taller, sharing their family's story during class discussions about fairness and equality. Friends admired them, teachers praised them, and classmates looked up to them. Though they were still young, they understood that their parents' fight wasn't just about them. It was about creating a world where everyone had a fair shot. The ripple effect. The impact of the case extended far beyond the mechanic's immediate circle. Across the town, people began to view authority figures differently. They asked tougher questions, demanded transparency, and refused to accept injustice without a fight. Community meetings grew larger and more frequent, with residents coming together to discuss issues ranging from housing rights to policing practices. Even local officials noticed the shift, realizing they couldn't operate behind closed doors anymore. Accountability became the new norm. Schools incorporated lessons about civic responsibility into their curriculums. using the mechanic's story as an example of how ordinary people could drive extraordinary change. Teachers encouraged students to think critically about fairness and morality, asking them to imagine what they would do if faced with similar challenges. Art projects, essays, and plays sprang up, celebrating themes of resilience and unity. The mechanic's face appeared on posters in classrooms, accompanied by quotes like, "Stand tall, stay true." Businesses got involved too. Local shops displayed signs supporting justice and equality, while restaurants hosted fundraisers to support advocacy groups. A group of artists collaborated on a mural downtown, depicting scenes from the case alongside messages of hope and solidarity. The mural quickly became a symbol of the town's transformation, a reminder that even in the darkest times light could shine through. Reflections and resolutions. For the detective, the case marked a turning point in his career. He'd always believed in justice, but this experience deepened his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. He started mentoring younger officers, teaching them the importance of listening to the community and staying true to their values. "It's easy to lose sight of why we do this job," he told them. "But remember, you're here to serve, not to rule." He also worked closely with the district attorney to implement reforms within the police department. Together, they pushed for training programs focused on ethics and cultural sensitivity, ensuring that officers understood the weight of their roles. Transparency became a priority, with regular updates shared with the public to build trust. Slowly but surely, the relationship between law enforcement and the community began to heal. The district attorney, meanwhile, continued to champion systemic change. She traveled to neighboring towns, sharing the lessons learned from the case, and urging others to adopt similar measures. Her efforts earned her recognition statewide, but she remained humble, crediting the mechanic and his family for inspiring her to take action. "They lit the fire," she said during one speech. "All I did was fan the flames." Hope for the future. Months later, the mechanic stood beside his wife at a community gathering, looking out at the sea of faces gathered around them. Families laughed, children played, and music floated through the air. It was a celebration, not just of their victory, but of the spirit that had brought everyone together. As he looked around, he felt a surge of gratitude. This wasn't just his story anymore, it belonged to everyone who had dared to hope for something better. In his heart, he knew the fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges, moments, when the scales tipped unfairly. But for now there was progress, and that was enough. Change didn't happen overnight, but it happened step by step, person by person. And in this small town surrounded by friends and allies, he saw proof that even the smallest acts of courage could spark a movement. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the park, the mechanic smiled. Life wasn't perfect, but it was moving in the right direction. Together they had shown that justice wasn't just a word, it was a promise. And promises, no matter how hard they were to keep, were worth fighting for.